Hello and welcome everyone. I am the Doge that reads. In today's episode of Dungeons & Dragons Horror Stories, we have a few tales of some less than great DMs. Whether it be discouraging creative thinking and roleplay, or self-inserting an overpowered DMPC, these next 3 tales of woe have it all. But first, I must ask, if you like what I do here, or just plain want to tell me how good a boy I am, liking, commenting, and sharing the video goes a long way to help this Doge out. Though, with that out of the way, let's get right into the stories. DM tells me to grow up for responding in character, by Reddit user Saren Levant. Content warning: ableism, suicide mention, and PTSD. You've been warned. If the above are going to cause mental distress that you are not okay with, do not continue reading. With that out of the way, let's begin. So I recently started a gothic horror / grimdark campaign with a group of friends and friends of friends. We have a session 0 and discuss our characters, and everything is great so far. The only people in the story that I didn't personally know is the DM. However, a close friend of mine assures me that they're a pretty easygoing individual, and Rogue, who we found through a Facebook group for our university, and is actually a fantastic person, despite what the following events might lead you to believe. Party is all decided. However, key to the story is only 2 characters of the 7-person party and the DM. Those would be Rogue, we'll call their player John, who's playing a Dampier Thief Rogue, who hungers for the color lavender, and me, playing a reborn Hexblade Warlock, whose patron is an echo of her maker's soul, reaching past the Shadowfell through a set of magical weaver's tools that were originally used to create my character. The DM and I worked out that the tools themselves are a pseudo-sentient magic item, containing a facsimile of my maker, that are capable of mending clothing, as if by use of the mending spell at will, and may also change the color of any fabric as I so choose. Now my character, Coraline, because I am endlessly unoriginal, is a sentient doll created by her maker as a child, abandoned later in her maker's life, and given life herself, Pinocchio style, when her maker killed herself after her husband was wrongfully accused of heresy and sentenced to life in exile. Every rest, she takes her routine of taking out her tools and mending the party's clothing, and will have panic attacks if she's unable to do so. Well, in a recent session, Rogue, with green light from me out of character, decided to steal my weaver's tools. After successfully stealing them, however, he loses them after shedding his surcoat to run away from an enemy. So now we've completely lost the tools, and technically my connection to my patron. After realizing my tools are literally missing, Coraline begins having a meltdown, and after learning Rogue was the reason they were lost, it took the entire party and Rogue profusely apologizing to calm her down and avoid possible PvP. I should note, I did make sure to get the green light for any possible PvP consequences that stealing my tools would bring. Party decides we're going to hunt down the tools. We eventually track the thief to an abandoned village on the outskirts of the kingdom, where we learn the tools have been destroyed. Coraline immediately kills the individual responsible and proceeds to start sobbing uncontrollably. After calming down, Coraline asks to hold a funeral for her mother, the tools, to which the DM responds, quote, "That's such a stupid idea. They're just an object." I explained to the DM that, while yes, the tools are not truly sentient and are in fact just a magical object, Coraline views them as a parental figure. You know, because they were literally used in her creation, and wouldn't care that they aren't actually sentient. DM says I'm acting childish and immature, and that I should just get over it and grow up, instead of whining about not being allowed to have a funeral for my patron. I adamantly refused to do anything until a funeral was held, to which the DM responds, quote, "I guess Coraline leaves the party then." An important fact is that the party is all for having a funeral for a set of inanimate objects. Nobody but the DM had an issue with this. Either way, I respond by saying, quote, "Guess I am too," and left. John messages me through Facebook, asking if I'm alright and apologizing for causing the entire situation. I assure him that he's fine and that he did nothing wrong. And then I message the group chat that I need some time to myself, and that I won't be making it to the rest of the sessions. Found out later that the DM made a comment about Hexblade being stupid and mocking me for being so attached to, quote, toys, ignoring the fact that these toys are responsible for my character's very existence. Man, I really hate it when I hear about DMs like this one. OP was really getting into their character and trying to roleplay in a really creative way. Wanting Coraline to have a funeral for the tools because she saw them as her mother since they were used in her creation was really interesting. And if I was the DM, I would have given a point of inspiration right then and there. For the DM to shoot it down and call it childish when all the other players are all about roleplaying this out is just wrong. And I don't blame OP for leading right then and there. Here's hoping that they're able to find a new game with a DM worthy of their creativity. On to the next story. The Worst DM PC I Have Ever Seen, by Reddit user NoCloud7275. This happened a while ago during an online game of 5e. The DM seemed nice and the party got along well. After Session 0, we began the campaign as caravan guards. One of the caravan guards was a black dragonborn NPC named Resnir, the star of this tale, and of the campaign, as we'd later find out. Resnir was a couple of levels above the rest of the party, who were only level 1. But we didn't mind as level 1 PCs are very squishy, and it wasn't unreasonable that there were stronger adventurers than us in the world. The caravan gets attacked by orcs, and the DM goes into great detail, describing how Resnir solos the orc chieftain and about 15 other orcs, and randomly swears that he will defeat his father after he beheads the orc chieftain. Following the session, we were all talking about the sesh, and the DM asked us what we thought of Resnir. We'd only just met the character, so our answers were pretty lukewarm, but looking back, the DM had clearly put a lot of weight on the question. As the game progresses, Resnir starts showing up more and more often and becomes more and more obnoxious, constantly monologuing about some prophecy and his destiny to one day slay his father, another black dragonborn who was being set up as the BBEG. The problem was that when the party didn't really show much interest in Resnir or voice this to the DM, he would only double down harder and make Resnir show up more often or be connected to quests in the most tedious way possible. The party is helping with rescuing a kidnapped villager from a goblin cave. Resnir shows up and saves the party with a trail of dead goblins behind him. The party is investigating a trail of heists. Resnir is too, and it's somehow related to his whole crusade against his father. It got to the point where almost every encounter we had with an NPC that wasn't Resnir would either keep talking about Resnir or would lead to Resnir. At one point, in desperation for something, anything other than Resnir, the party started galloping away from Resnir on horseback during one of his monologues about honor and duty, etc. And the DM describes Resnir continuing his monologue as he keeps up with the party while on foot and we're on horseback. The party had just about enough when we all confronted the DM about the fact that we weren't enjoying the fact that everything was resolving around this dragonborn, and if he could ease up a bit, to which the DM responded that, quote, "This story's about Resnir, and I'm not changing that." 2 players immediately left the group and didn't return, and the rest of us stayed out of a sense of either desperation for a game or morbid curiosity. The remainder of us had had enough, however, and conspired to get our revenge on the DM's DMPC, who had become the object of all of our frustrations. In the final battle against Resnir's father, I guess the DM thought he was throwing us a bone when he had Resnir be grievously wounded and beg for our aid. See, according to the DM, this was our defining climatic moment, defending his DMPC from a bunch of mooks until he could gather the strength to pull together and defeat his BBEG father. But we didn't do that. Instead, almost as one, we all decided to swear our allegiance to Resnir's father, and attacked Resnir while he was down. We were a pretty high level at that point, and dealt at least 200 damage to the Black Dragonborn in one round. When the DM seethed and tried to retcon our actions, or hand-waved them away, we pushed back and used his own words against him over how injured Resnir was. Finally, after a long moment of silence, when the DM realized his precious DMPC is fucked, he utters the words I will never forget. Quote, "As you sink your weapons into the body of Resnir, you feel no resistance, and Resnir the Black fades. It's a hologram." I left the group, and so did the others from what I hear. TLDR, DM makes OP DMPC, forces him into everything and makes plot revolve around him, then has him turn out to be a hologram when a fed-up party tries to kill him. Oh my god, that is quite hilarious. Another DM that uses DMPCs to appease his main character syndrome. While I will always advise that grievances be brought up out of game, it did seem like OP and the rest of the players did say something to the DM, only to be shot down. Personally, the moment the DM said that Rezmir was the main focus of the story, I would have up and left like 2 of the other players did. Though the players that stayed turning the tables on the DM to essentially flip the table on Rezmir's story, only for the DM to shout out that he was a hologram, is one of the best endings to a bad DM story I have ever read. Do you think that the OP and the other players handled themselves well in the face of this overpowered DMPC? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. But let's move on to the last story. DM makes my character for me and kills him off in the first session, by Reddit user HQUT. I joined a game run by a friend of a friend 3 or 4 years back. The campaign had been going on for 10 or so sessions, so it wasn't too hard to blend into the group. However, some NPCs and one PC were characters from a much older campaign that ended a long time ago. In the first session, the DM introduced me to a system. It was entirely homebrew and geared for more casual play, which was no problem whatsoever. The first thing that caught me off guard was that the DM told me to roll for a race in class. I brushed it off as convenient, seeing as I didn't know what races or classes were even available. I quickly realized that nobody else was rolling, as they already had characters. In the party, there was Smith, a halfling fighter thief taken from the previous campaign, Cybele, a human magician, entirely a lovely player and developed character whom I'd love to play with again, Hilda, a DMPC fighter who was really there because the encounters were balanced for 4 people. She essentially disappeared out of combat. That said, I rolled a D100 for race and another for class. First, I rolled a cleric. I enjoy support characters, so I had no issue whatsoever. For race, I rolled a 22. 22 meant I was a gnome. The DM sighed and asked me to roll again. Another 22. The DM was visibly angry, mentioning that that was the only number for gnome, and said that I was going to have to try hard to make him warm up to my character, because he despised gnomes. About 30 minutes of rolling later, I had a standard set of 6 stats, as well as sight, smell, taste, and hearing. I was also 478 years old, and an aristocrat, who worshipped Democademus, the god of elemental earth. I wasn't entirely clear on the rules, but the DM did a good job of explaining as we went. The party met in the city of Fish Ponds, a gnomocracy, funnily enough, that was under bombardment by a mad mage. It seemed like the DM went out of his way to make the resident gnomes particularly unlikable, but the story was set up fairly smoothly. The party ventured into the mage's tower and began clearing out traps. I was in the back line of the party, yet, as I stepped onto a tile everybody else had happened to have dodged, a hellhound was summoned right next to me. Cue combat. The first turn of combat, I attempted to dispel undead and rolled 100, which was a critical success. The hellhound immediately burst into flames, which dealt an alarming amount of damage to me and me only. The damage was so grievous that one of my arms had to be amputated, which meant I had a 50% chance to fail any spell check or attack until I visited a healer. I also couldn't heal it myself, because my magic is benevolent and does not allow selfish motivations. The DMPC made a mocking comment about gnomes, and we went on our way. It was also worth noting that, because the combat was so short, it apparently meant we didn't deserve any XP. 1 or 2 rooms later, we reached the top of the tower, where a giant crystal, overcharged with necromantic energy, hovered in the center of the room. Waves of pitch-black darkness pulsed through the air, as the crystal searched for life energy to consume. Smith noticed that the space above the crystal was seemingly unaffected, and Cybele decided to scribe a scroll of teleportation so that we could dodge whatever the crystal might do. Cybele began to chant, and Smith, Hilda, and herself all disappeared in a puff of smoke, reappearing on top of the crystal. I, however, was still in the entrance to the room. I asked the DM why that was. Cybele knew that the scroll affected any number of creatures and swore that she meant to bring me along too. Apparently, because Cybele was a human, the magic did not identify that I was a person because I was so much shorter and minus an arm. Never mind the fact that Smith was a halfling and Hilda had a prosthetic leg. No matter how much they tried, the three of them couldn't break the crystal. Only I, with my knowledge and mastery of Earth, could find the vital spot. I couldn't, however, do it from afar, which was maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I stepped forward immediately after a wave of energy dissipated. Quote, roll a d6. My first roll was a 6, meaning that I safely dodged the brunt of the magic, only taking 1 or 2 points of damage. I was safe to move forward, but only one step the DM interjected. Roll after roll, I was ducking and weaving. Halfway towards the crystal, on my 8th or 9th roll, I finally rolled a 1. Dark magic washed over me, and I died, instantly. Post-mortem, my allies became able to break the crystal themselves, and grabbed my lifeless body, hoping to carry me to Fishpond's resident healer. It was then that the tower collapsed. My friends were battered and bruised, but my body was completely and utterly crushed. Beyond repair, the DM was happy to note, without appearing to make any type of roll. The DMPC said something along the lines of, quote, thank God he's gone, and bagged the reward money as well as my magic items. I was fairly new to tabletop RPGs as a whole, so I thought it was simply bad luck, or a joke I didn't quite get. Nonetheless, I didn't come back to roll another character. TLDR, DM makes me roll for a race and class, and is upset that I got gnome, fudges rolls to the point my arm was cut off, makes jokes at my expense through a DMPC, decides that I couldn't use teleportation magic to avoid a trap because I was too short/disfigured, resulting in an instant, undodgeable death for only me. My body is then crushed beyond repair, and the DMPC loots my bags. Honestly, if the DM hated gnomes that much, why the hell would he even put that race on the table for his weird roll for race and class homebrew anyway? Just that would have been a huge red flag for me, and I would have stepped away right then and there. Though, I can understand why OP stuck around since it was his friend's game, and I totally get the craving and allure for tabletop RPGs. But to then have his DMPC constantly berate and insult the character, maim him for rolling a crit success against an enemy, and then have him die through tedious rolls and not letting the other party members help is just really scummy. Then to find out that this was one of OP's introductions to tabletop RPGs really pisses me off, as this could have turned him away from any tabletop RPGs in the future. I hope OP didn't lose hope for D&D because of this, and that he was able to find a good game with a good DM eventually. Have you ever had a bad experience with a DM, or even a DM using a DMPC? Was your introduction to tabletop RPGs a bad one? If so, feel free to vent about it in the comments. If you have a story that you would like shared on the channel, feel free to post it in the comments on the channel subreddit r/D&D Doge, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope you have some really good DMs. Until next time.